Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Devin Early in Fundamentals of Communications. This is my informative speech, and today I would like to teach you a few things about my favorite president of all time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also known as FDR. That's probably makes him sound a little bit more familiar to you. And I'd like to talk today partially about some of the more well known things about him and why they're important, but also some of the lesser known things that many of you may not have known prior to this. I know that I did not know these things until very recently, and we'll talk about that. So, to start off, we'll go with one of the more known things, and that is that FDR was the first and only president to be consecutively elected to more than two terms. He was actually elected to four. Now, many people speculate why this happened because traditionally it hadn't happened in the past, really. There was no law against it at this time. But my favorite reason, regardless of what people speculate and what I think is the truth, is because of World War II. So, World War II went on for several years. It was a bloody, awful war that involved many of the superpowers in the world at that time. And the American people didn't really think that we should be changing leadership during such an intense war, such an important war that involved so many important parties of the world. So he was elected to four terms. A couple of those elections were in a landslide. He did fulfill three out of the four of those terms, but he unfortunately passed, I believe it was 6 to 8 weeks into his fourth and final term. He passed. Very shortly after that, Congress passed the law limiting presidents to only two terms, which is probably a good thing in hindsight. We don't want any president to get too powerful. So we have FDR to thank for that, for term limits for presidents. Something else that a lot of people may not know about him, moving on to the lesser known facts, FDR and Teddy Roosevelt were actually distant cousins. Some people know that, I find, some others do not. They were, I believe, seventh or eighth cousins, so nothing crazy, not enough to where they hung out all the time or anything like that, but they were distant cousins. And the reason that I bring that up now is because it kind of ties into the next interesting fact about him, if you will. So Franklin and the first lady at the time, his wife Eleanor, we find were also distant cousins, surprisingly enough. Now, don't get any wild ideas. I believe it's not enough to be considered inbreeding, and that I doubt that they would have allowed that marriage to happen if it was. But they were even more distantly related than Teddy and Franklin were, but cousins nonetheless. So that was very interesting. Now, regarding Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, I recently learned this on a podcast that I've been listening to. It's called, if any of you want to check it out, Very Presidential. It's hosted by Ashley Flowers. You can find it on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, wherever you happen to listen to that at. Very presidential. Each episode, she outlines a different president. And so I very recently listened to the one about Franklin Roosevelt. As many of you know, some of you may not know, Franklin was seen as the president who brought us out of the Great Depression. And one very interesting and awesome thing that I learned in this podcast about that time was in the midst of the Depression, Franklin and his wife, the First Lady Eleanor, changed the menu in the White House. Now, I'm sure many of you expect that a president has very lavish meals. They're catered to regardless of what the economic status is for the rest of the country. There's no surprise there. But they changed the menu to what they called more nutritious and economical meals so that the people struggling the most within the country did not feel left out. And they continued to do that until they had seen that they'd gotten us through the Depression. So that to me was so awesome. I thought it was cool that a president and first lady would kind of take themselves down a few notches just to uh, make the country feel a little bit better about the troubles that they were facing at the time. So that brings me to the last fact about Franklin Roosevelt that it shocked me in a way because he is seen as this very virtuous, moral president who was very accomplished. It also didn't surprise me in a way because I imagine many presidents have done this. So it turns out Franklin had a handful of mistresses, shockingly enough, and that he and his wife excuse me, Eleanor, would really only do the deed to procreate, to have children. That was the only thing that they, within their marriage, saw that necessary for. So he had several mistresses. One of them worked in the White House as a lead secretary throughout his entire administration. That blew my mind because when you think about Franklin Roosevelt, you just don't think about things like that. Maybe other presidents, maybe like Andrew Jackson or any other firebrand presidents from the past, but I was so shocked to hear that about FDR. And now I think that I'm running out of time, so I'll try to close out here and leave you with this. FDR is my favorite president of all time. He was a very accomplished president, regardless of what opinions people may have of him. Maybe had some moral slip ups, as we all do. And again, if you want to listen to the podcast that I got a lot of this info from, it is called Very Presidential by Ashley Flowers on Spotify or Apple Music. Thank you so much.